Hello, and welcome to this webcast from the Anti-Fraud Collaboration. I'm Cindy Fornelli, Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality, and I'm pleased to moderate our discussion. Today, our topic is Coming to Terms with Short-Termism, Implications for Fraud. We will discuss how goals for long-term value creation may conflict with incentives that are introduced to meet short-term goals, and we'll be looking at it through the lens of deterring financial fraud. Simply put, too much emphasis on short-term results can increase the risk of financial reporting fraud because of the pressures to meet expectations, whether external pressure from analysts or internal from management. Today we're going to explore such risks, and we'll gather actionable recommendations for how we might mitigate those risks. The Anti-Fraud Collaboration represents the joint efforts of the Center for Audit Quality, Financial Executives International, the National Association of Corporate Directors, and the Institute of Internal Auditors. Our organizations are all actively engaged in efforts to promote the integrity of financial reporting. Before we get started, however, I do have a few housekeeping matters. As you heard on the introductory video, you may ask content-related questions at any time during the webcast by entering your question in the Q&A panel. Today's webcast qualifies for 1.5 CPE credits, and as noted on slide 2, it also qualifies for 1.5 NACD skill-specific credits, which can be applied to one of the 2 fellow programs offered by the NACD. For those of you who have registered for CPE or NACD credit, you must confirm your attendance throughout this webcast by clicking the participation pop-up markers. Now let's move on to today's program. Slide 3 sets out our goals for this webcast, which are the following. Explore how to improve the balance and identify ways to mitigate the risks of short-termism. Discuss what successful companies do to reinforce the alignment between these seemingly conflicting goals. And provide actionable recommendations that each supply chain member can implement in their organizations. We have a great panel of experts to help us meet those objectives, so let's turn to slide 4 and I'll give you a quick introduction of each panelist. In alphabetical order, we'll start with Doug Cha. Doug is the Executive Director of the Conference Board Governance Center, and he joined the Conference Board this past February. Previously, he was Assistant General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Johnson & Johnson, and he also worked at Tyco International. Doug has practiced law at global firms in both New York and Hong Kong. Doug, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
Cindy, thanks so much for having me.
Also with us today is Karen Horn. Karen is the chair of the NACD Board of Directors and served as co-chair of the NACD's Blue Ribbon Commission on the Board and Long-Term Value Creation. Karen serves as the director of Simon Property Group, where she chairs the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committees. A holder of a PhD in economics, Karen is also vice chairman of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Karen, we're very pleased to have you here.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm delighted to be here.
Our third panelist is Bill McCracken, president of the Executive Consulting Group, and Bill also serves on the NACD Board of Directors. He co-chaired the NACD's Blue Ribbon Commission on the Board and Long-Term Value Creation with Karen. Bill has deep experience in the technology sector. From 2010 until 2013, he was CEO at CA Technologies, one of the world's largest providers of IT management software. Prior to CA Technologies, Bill spent 36 years at IBM in various executive roles. Bill, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks, Cindy.
And last, but certainly by no means least, is Jose Rodriguez. Jose is a senior audit partner at KPMG, where he also serves as an SEC reviewing partner and a foreign filing review partner. Jose's experience has been primarily with large and mid-sized companies, both public and private, in the consumer and retail markets. He also has experience with initial public offerings, mergers and acquisitions, and international financial reporting standards audits. We're very glad to have you on our panel today too, Jose.
Thank you, Cindy. It's great to be here.
So let's turn to slide 5 and dive into the substance of our program. An important starting point in this discussion are two reports that were published late last year. One is a report that was issued by the Conference Board, which asks if short-term behavior is jeopardizing the future prosperity of business. This report takes a close look at the key drivers of a short-term focus and highlights some of the economic realities that have resulted. The second report, which was the result of the Blue Ribbon Commission that Karen and Bill co-authored, focuses on the need for corporate leaders to align the relationship between short-term results and long-term value creation. Both of these reports provide recommendations for achieving a balance between short-term and long-term strategies. So Karen, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you, what was the impetus for the NACD's report?
Management faces short-term challenges all the time, day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter. And in addition to that, they have to be ready to respond to events. We also think that the external environment probably puts even more pressure on short-term thinking and reactions. Economic volatility, regulatory uncertainty, and investor pressures. So we wanted to look at factors that were really in the board's sphere of responsibilities. And in doing that, we also wanted to talk about the alignment that Cindy mentioned, because short-termism can have a very negative context, and it is if the short-term actions are in conflict with long-term value creation. But the long term is made up of many, many short-term actions. So we wanted to really focus on aligning the short-term actions to get to long-term value creation.
So Bill, you also were the co-chair of the group that wrote that report. And as we see on slide 6, there's a number of areas that have resulted in the intensified pressure on company management. Talk about the pressures that management can face from investors.
Yeah, Cindy, it's a good question, and I think an important part of what we're talking about here. One of the things that when I was CEO at CA, and I would meet with our largest shareholders, one of the first questions I usually ask them is, how are you doing? How's your year? Because it had a lot to do with what they needed from us. What did we need to do? How did we need to respond? And so I think that along with the things that Karen mentioned as well too, when we took a look at the short-term, long-term piece, really sets the stage, I think, very importantly in today's environment for the board to be engaged. Because clearly their involvement, their understanding for where we're going, what we're doing now, how it relates to the future, as Karen mentioned, and to tie those things together, the board can really become a very important buffer with respect to the investors and what the marketplace expects of them. We'll talk more about it, but I think it's a very important area for the board to be a part of.
And so, Doug, the Conference Board also has a report that focuses on some of these issues. What are some of the pressures that the Conference Board found in your report?
Well, I think picking up on where Karen and Bill were going, in terms of pressures from outsiders such as investors, one thing that's been very, a big topic lately has been shareholder activism. And so we found that activism definitely is part of what's driving this. Now, it's not so much that there are activists at the door of every company, but I think a number of cases have given people the idea that this could happen to any company. So there's been, I'd say, a lot of hype around this, and as a result, management is trying to prepare for that and say, okay, well, what kind of things can we do in the short term to ward off these activists? And so then people start thinking of, well, maybe we should do a buyback, or maybe we should do a larger buyback than we were going to do, spin off companies. And so, it's more the perception of activists being at the door than the reality, which is that, there are a number of activists situations every year, but it's very small in the grand scheme of things. Another pressure or another I guess driving factor is executive compensation. I think we've seen that in the wake of say on pay. It has had the effect of increasing engagement between the companies and their shareholders. But I think in the executive comp world, you see that exec comp plan design has become somewhat homogenized, where companies are not able to get very creative for fear of losing say on pay votes, and what things have coalesced around designs that are heavily weighted on equity payouts, and those equity payouts are based on the achievement of fairly short-term incentives. 3 years is not anyone's definition of long-term when you start surveying business people. And so, but we call 3-year PSUs long-term incentives. So it's I think it's a big problem.
Jose, I want to bring you into the conversation because as the external auditor, you're viewing this through a slightly different lens. But what do you see with respect to these pressures when you sit with audit committees?
Well, first of all, the pressures are real. And the pressures are, as been mentioned here, it's both external, but then you've got internal pressures, based on plans, based on goals. So, as an auditor, I try to really understand, have a good understanding of the company, the business, and exactly what are those metrics, those pressures that management is facing. And I'll design my audits, part of my audits at least, to looking at those. And I'll have a very frank conversation with the audit committees that I work with on, how I intend to tackle the audit in light of those both external and internal pressures. But they're real.
So I want to get your perspectives, all of your perspectives on something, which is how do we define short-termism? Doug, you kind of mentioned that 3 years seems like a short period of time, and yet in many places that's considered long-term. Do you all have a working definition of what you mean by short-termism?
I think a company will have a should have a working definition because it'll vary between industry and even business model within an industry. So if you were talking about a pharmaceutical company, if that were a company whose business model was to do research and development starting from the beginning, then long-term might be a 10-year cycle. But if it were a pharmaceutical company that was buying in research and then doing late stage testing and so forth, then the long term would be shorter, even within the same industry.
Yeah, let me pick up on that, Cindy, because it really varies so much by company, by industry. And Doug, I'll challenge a little bit maybe the 3-year. You take a look at a technology company. Back in the 70s, Moore from Intel created what was known as Moore's Law. And he said technology doubles every 18 months. It's probably every 6 months now. And so in a technology industry or a company, a new design will be thought of, designed, implemented, sold, and start to go end of life before you get to 3 years. So it does, I think, it depends on the company. And I think as auditors and audit committee folks, that's the nature of the kinds of questions that they should be asking of the people when they're talking short-term, long-term, and coming up with their understanding of what that is together, because then it can be expressed to the investors as well too.
Cindy, I agree that the definition of long-term, short-term will all depend on the company and the industry, but sitting from an auditor's perspective, I got to worry about the current year, financial statement, but I also have to worry about the quarters. So I would define short-term, at least from an audit perspective, would be on a quarterly basis and at that year end, or for the year. From a business operating perspective, I don't see a year as being short-term. I see 2-3 years really as being short-term.
Yeah, I mean, our research showed that 3 years is really not anyone's definition. It kind of ranged from 4, which was technology. Now, obviously, this is kind of aggregated. So, 3 or 4 was the technology executives' kind of definition of what where the short-term, long-term split happen, and then for mining, it's like 16 or 17 years. So as we said, it depends on the industry.
And wide variances.
But an oil company, a refinery company, their idea of short versus long is going to be a lot different, and they're going to want to design their comp plans accordingly. And there's a lot of pressure from investors to really conform to what everybody else is doing.
So I think you need to help with what Doug's saying too. I think you need to talk about, is it strategy or is it comp? Because if it's strategy, 3 years may be short. All right. If it's compensation, you could argue maybe effectively too that says, on the compensation side, even though the birth to death on the technology side is shorter, have we really been able to determine was a comp appropriately paid and rewarded appropriately to reward their shareholders in the proper way? So I think maybe it's different when a board looks at it from a comp point of view and asks questions. Audit committee the same way. Maybe it's different when we're talking about strategy, because the steps that need to go through to get to the end point on a strategy may elongate even more. So I think it probably varies between those two discussions, and maybe boards ought to approach it that way along with audit committees as well, I think.
And it's a very good point about strategy, and this is, boards really need to be conversant with the company's strategy. They need to be engaged in understanding it, and because this will, there's short term, there's long term, and then there's strategic term perhaps, and all of those are just critical concepts in creating long-term value.
I think you just coined a new time frame, Karen, strategic term. I like that. We do have a question from our audience who wants to know, do private companies or even governments face short-termism in their dealings, or is this something that's really primarily limited to public companies?
I think both of them face short-termism. Take a government, and you look at infrastructure. Do you repair and keep your infrastructure up, or you just keep on deferring it? And a deferral could have a significant future economic impact, but they're avoiding the current year budget. So, and the same thing would apply to a public company as a private company. They may have less external, drivers or pressures, but to me, it's still the same strategic issue.
So I think on private equity too, or a private company, they need to know who their investors are, because some clearly, 10 years is fine. That's what they set out to do. That's what they intend to do. But there's others that want to flip it a lot sooner than that. So I think that the management and the then current owners of a small private organization need to be thoughtful and careful about how they choose who they have investing with them, and understand what the expectations are. There could be differences even in the people that invest with them too. Some may be in more of a hurry than others are, but yes, I think it does happen. Depends upon who's investing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be, there's going to be similar dynamics, but with government, it's hard for me to comment without getting really energized and kind of, angry. But with private companies, I mean, they face the same type of pressures to perform financially and business-wise, but they don't have as much of the noise being thrown at them on a daily basis from the media, from the analysts, all these expectations, and some people chiming in from the peanut gallery. They're able to really focus on what they're supposed to be doing, and that might be short term. It's short-term turnaround, and their owners are gonna let them know about that. But they're not going to have the entire world, and with their chiming in with opinions and have to sometimes succumb to that type of pressure.
Well, that leads to another question that we've received from one of our viewers, in a way, and that is that part of the pressure comes from investors expecting periodic, oftentimes quarterly, reports, which I don't know if that's something that private companies face as much, that expectation that there's going to be quarterly reporting. How much of that it factors into the short term outlook, and is that something that either the Conference Board or the NACD weighed in on in your reports, whether or not we should consider moving away from quarterly reporting?
Do you want to speak first?
You go first.
Okay.
The answer is yes, we
is
did.
I was going to guess the answer
The
was
answer
yes,
is
since
yes.
you both wanted to answer.
and I, it's enormously important. Google, a major company in the U.S. now today, and maybe ask the question: do they provide quarterly guidance? What will come back on all of them won't be the answer to the question probably. It'll be they've made the last 3 quarters. They missed 2 quarters ago. It looks like they'll make the 4 quarters this year. It's intense. It's as though the quarter ends the life of the organization. So that's why I think we're having a discussion here today. We'll talk about it in a lot more detail. I mean, the major media organizations, they announce earnings season starts next week, and it's in banners, and so everybody's thinking about it. And the fact is that is a significant pressure, and I think management feels it. The employees probably feel it more than maybe management wants them to, because they read the press, they listen to the press, and so it sort of works its way into the culture. And when the management's trying to maybe get their focus out a little bit, it's hard to accomplish because they're being bombarded with the daily, quarterly things.
And we did in the report indicate how desirable it would be not to be giving quarterly guidance. But we are also very much aware of how difficult it is not to, depending on what industry you're in, what others are doing. And sometimes companies who have stopped giving quarterly guidance find that expectations are not anywhere near what they're going to actually produce on the road. So there are a lot of issues with trying to take quarterly pressures off, but they are not easy to. There's no easy fix.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we also spent time on quarterly capitalism and this culture around that, and it is really a cultural problem. I mean, my entire career as a securities lawyer has been focused on quarters, and the pressure is intense. Everybody knows that Alcoa is first out of the gate, and so our entire structure is built around quarterly reporting. So in our report, we recommend that companies really avoid giving quarterly guidance. But in my mind, it goes farther than that. It's you can stop giving quarterly guidance, then you'll give annual guidance. But the annual guidance, more or less each quarter you're kind of giving quarterly guidance. You just call it annual guidance. But there's still going to be the expectation out there, and there's going to be the first call. But it's really about quarterly reporting. And some jurisdictions outside the United States are experimenting with going to a system where it's less than quarterly reporting.
Whether
and so
it's biannual or annual.
So then you take that, you change the game that way. But in this country, for people to suggest that there'd be less disclosure or less frequent disclosure is going to be an incredibly tough sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm going to move us along onto slide 7 now, because I want to look at some quantifiable data that we have here that came from the Conference Board report. But one thing I want to talk about to kind of frame our discussion on this is that we've seen a McKinsey survey of C-suite level executives who found that they feel real pressure to improve performance within a 2-year period, which doesn't seem like an incredibly long time for me, in order to try to improve things. And so also, according to that same study, 86% of the C-suite executives said that a longer time horizon for them would have a more positive impact on the financial returns and innovations in a company. So it's not just they're feeling the pressure for themselves, they're feeling it for their company. And Doug, looking at slide 7, which comes from your report, it shows the impact of the trade-offs between long and short-term focus. And we can see there was a peak in investment in the business that we're looking at here in 2000 to 2001, but then there was a significant decline after that. Explain to us a little bit more what this chart's telling us.
Yeah, so caveat, I'm not an economist. Even pretending to be one
You
is
have one
dangerous,
right next to it.
especially sitting next to a PhD. But I will try, since this was our report. What this is showing is what's called the financing gap in the non-financial sectors. And so I guess in layman's terms, it's really capital spending minus internal funds or cash flow. And so you see, that at the end on the far right, the line trailing down quite a bit into negative territory, which basically means that companies are not spending their cash flow on capital expenditures like they had in the past. I mean, in the run up to kind of the turn of the century, there was a lot of technology spending going on then. But now, business uncertainty has set in, and so companies are kind of keeping their powder dry, keeping their cash at home. But in a low interest rate environment, you've got to ask, well, it doesn't make that, why are they doing that? Doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And that's when you get the pressure for buybacks, saying, well, if you're not going to spend it on capital expenditure, give it back to the shareholders. But the question is, well, why aren't companies spending it on capital expenditure when kind of fundamentally that's what they should be doing? That's what we're talking about here in terms of the whys and the driving factors.
So Jose, all this talk about short-termism and the impact, does this factor into how you scope your audit? Is this something that you consider? And I know obviously one of the roles of the auditor is to assess a company's fraud risk. Do you view short-termism as a fraud risk?
Absolutely. And, once again, I'll go back to depending on the company. One of the things that I always look at when, doing my planning and especially assessing fraud is what's the tone at the top of that organization? If that organization is constantly talking about analyst expectations, what's my quarter results going to be? How close am I? What's my year-end results going to be? Quite frankly, it raises my antennas, and I'm gonna look closer at what those KPIs are, what those metrics are, and what behavior would affect them getting to 96 cents a quarter versus 94 cents a quarter. So absolutely it does, but I think it will depend on the company, and I can't underemphasize the tone at the top. And how do they talk to their employees? Is everything gauged around meeting that analyst expectation? Well, as an auditor, that would be a little concerning for me.
And I agree that the auditors are just a very important resource in this area. In the audit committee meetings, and especially in the executive sessions, the auditors are a wonderful semi-inside, semi-outside source of really understanding what the culture is at the company and what the tone is.
And I expect as an external auditor, I expect to be having a very frank conversation with the audit committee and making sure that I have the clear understanding and also expressing what my concerns are.
So Cindy, when you asked the question, you made, I think the comment you made that 86% of the C-suite would like to have it be longer. Mm-hmm. So let's say that's so. But is that enough then, or are we finished? I think I'd make two comments. Number one is it drives the point, I think, so well that says you need to have the short term connected to the long term. Because if you say just long term and we'll talk to you in 2 years, what's going on? What do you know from an audit point of view? What do you know from a board point of view? What do you know from an investor point of view? So if you've defined that for that point in time, wherever that is, longer term, you have these activities going on and the measurement of those are important to the accomplishment of that, then you're looking at operations as well too, one thing. Second thing is when you look at the curve that Doug had there too. I think audit committees and board members ought to be looking at things like what's the amount of cash required for the dividend, and what's the amount of free cash generated annually. And if the amount of free cash generated annually is less than the dividend, essentially they're borrowing money to pay a dividend, doesn't meet the definition of what a dividend is. So I think it's some of those kinds of details that folks could be looking at and asking with respect to long and short-term kinds of things.
So I want to talk a little bit, we mentioned earlier, Doug, you did activist investors. First of all, we have a question from one of our audience members wanting to know what exactly is an activist investor, and do they exert more short-term pressure on companies?
Well, so this question, it's a very complicated question, or the answer is quite complicated. Activism has many shapes and sizes, people with different strategies. There are I think what most people now refer to as the hedge fund activists, which are really the financial activists that they take significant stakes in companies, and then they present their kind of competing strategy or alternative helpful suggestions to management in terms of how they think the business should change to make that company, perform up to what they see its value is. You have other types of activists who are, social activists, environmental. They're pushing for different kind of behavioral changes. I think when people refer to pressure from activists, they're really referring to the hedge fund types. Not all of them are short term. Probably the ones that get the most attention are pushing short-term type strategies or tactics, but there are plenty of constructive activists with really good track records. But because of the attention placed on the short-term situations, that's what has management getting very nervous about. Like, we don't want our name to be the next one in the paper when they say, "Come and break up the company." So, yeah.
I sometimes use the word active investor. Activist can have a very negative and very short-term connotation. And sometimes I use the word active for investor for putting forth a better way of thinking about what we ought to be doing around the board table, and that we ought to, as a board, be thinking like active investors. And some boards, as they assess what kind of talents they want around the board table, even want someone in a board seat who has been an active investor or who has a way of knowing a lot about how they think.
Let me pick up on what Karen said. In fact, let me take the term, though, and take activist and try to maybe turn it into a good term, because it has had a bad connotation to it for many reasons, and as Doug was speaking about it. But if we had activist boards, that is, boards that are engaged in looking at the company, understand the environment, understand the industry, understand the competitors, understand new technology shifts, things that are going on that will dislocate the market in the way they market today, whatever that is, whatever good and service they provide. If the board is coming at it as an activist doing that, then it's a different world out there. And it goes back to one of the earlier comments I think that Doug made, is that if somebody arrives at your doorstep and has a question, you'll have an answer, because you have looked at all those things and you understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's the right thing to do.
And you might have already communicated that answer or part of that answer to your investors.
So we've coined two new terms, or at least two new concepts to me. We have strategy term and activist board. I like that. I am going to move us along now to slide 8, and we're going to talk about something that I think is somewhat tied to quarterly, the focus on quarterly reporting, and that is non-GAAP measures. So that's been in the news a lot lately. We've heard Mary Jo White recently, last week at San Francisco, was at a conference talking about the guidance that corporation finance had issued with respect to the SEC's expectations about the use of non-GAAP measures, that they want them to be transparent, consistent, the non-GAAP measures can't be more prominent than the GAAP measures. And she gave a pretty stern warning that if companies don't comply with their guidance, they should expect a knock on the door from the SEC, not from CorpFin with a comment letter, but from enforcement with a Wells notice. So really a focus and in the news. And yet, non-GAAP measures can be helpful. It's not that they're all bad. And so I wanted to get a little bit of a discussion, since it is so much in the news going, about what the use of these are and how companies might think about them. And I guess just a little bit, Jose, in terms of level setting. By definition, non-GAAP measures are not compiled in accordance with U.S. GAAP. But what role does the auditor play in looking at these measures? Because, of course, you don't audit them.
Well, as an auditor, I would be thrilled if a company never used a non-GAAP measure. But I also know that that's also impossible.
Well, there's some that do, but yeah.
Well, there's some that do. I think non-GAAP measures do have a place. They can give insights to a company. You know, you can look at same-store sales if you're a retailer, an important metric, inventory turnover at a retailer or manufacturing company. So they are important, but I think, you know, the key thing with non-GAAP measure is, one, why is it important for someone to understand the business? Okay, that to me, they need to answer that gating question first. And then it comes down to the transparency and the consistency. But, you know, also, is it normal or is it not normal within your organization? And I'll pick on a company that has a restructuring charge every quarter, every year. So is that restructuring charge really abnormal to their operation? I would say no. So should they have it as a non-GAAP? You know, my preference would be no. But you're right, as an auditor, I don't have responsibility for non-GAAP measures, but I do have a responsibility to question management on it, and I do have a responsibility, I feel, to give my views and express those to management and the audit committee. But you're right, I don't have responsibility for non-GAAPs.
Well, so speaking about questions, because I think audit committees also should be questioning management on their use of non-GAAP measures and why they're using those particular measures, or whether we call them non-GAAP measures or key performance indicators or what have you. And so looking at slide 9 now, I will give a plug that the CAQ recently issued a tool for audit committees, helping them think through what some questions that they can ask of management with respect to their use of non-GAAP measures. And we actually built it off of the SEC's guidance that they gave to companies. So ours certainly isn't meant to be guidance, but more of a framework. But I'm just curious, Karen and Bill, from your perspectives, what are the kinds of questions that audit committees should be asking management about their use of non-GAAP measures?
And I will get to that in one second, but just to say that, going back to tone at the top, we will get very specific, I think, in this discussion. But if you have the right tone, that helps people make the right decisions. And your first line of defense is management here. And the audit committee is the second line of defense. And then we have regulators and external auditors to help as well. But so moving to something more specific than tone, but tone is really important. There should be a really robust discussion at the audit committee of this. And that discussion should include understanding the industry and what others in the industry are doing, and then understanding what the policies are and whether they're being consistently implemented. And here, of course, the external auditors are very helpful to us in the conversation. And then, I mean, simple question like, whenever we use a non-GAAP adjustment, does it mean a positive change in what we're showing investors, or sometimes does it go the other way?
So I think first, the document you put out is excellent, because I think it does raise the kind of questions that audit committees are looking at. Let me pick up on one of the points that Jose made when he talked about restructuring charge. And I think it's, and I can speak to it, when I was a CEO, because of the nature of the business we were in, we were changing and modifying our direction a lot. We were a technology company, so the competition was moving rapidly. We had to move rapidly as well. And so we were doing some of what you said. We were having a restructuring charge. And we ask ourselves, is this something that is unique and it's happening for a few quarters here? Or is this sort of a way of life in the future, because you need new skills, you need new people, you need people that have experience in industry that you've not been in the past? And our answer to ourselves was, you know what? We're probably going to have this all the time, so we're not going to use it anymore. We're not going to even use restructuring charge. It's just a cost of business, and it's one of the kinds of things we have to do. Then I think on the positive side, from that another perspective could be, so you have a long-term strategy, and let me pick on on retailers. They've been brick and mortar retailers, and you've got Amazon sitting over here eating their lunch, and they're doing online business. And so they're saying, okay, we've got to shift to have a capability for online business as well. And one of the measures we're going to measure ourselves on to know the progress we're making is how many inquiries do we have with respect to our products, how many buys do we have with things that are key, that have a direct relationship to what they need to do to expand that capability, and that should have a direct relationship to performance in the future. That, I think, can be very helpful, and it can be informative to the investors as well, too. The challenge, I think, is for the auditors and the audit committee is it appropriately calculated? Is it consistently calculated? And is it dependable? And I think that's the kind of thing that, and I think as management, you have to be sure you're not leading your investors, because you will get a comment letter, and maybe more than that if it doesn't, I think, show in the right way.
Well, Bill, I think you brought up a good point. I mean, though as an auditor, I may not be responsible for a non-GAAP measure, management sure is. And the integrity of how that non-GAAP measure is being compiled. At the end of the day, that is still subject to disclosure committee controls, and I think companies sometimes may lose sight of that. It may not be covered under ICOFR, but it better be covered under your disclosure committee and your internal controls on how those non-GAAP measures are accumulated, to your point.
Well, I think not only that, and here's where I think the recent guidance will eventually take us, in terms of those discussions that you said have to take place, the tough discussions that have to take place in the boardroom. Management has to explain to the board, why are we using these measures and presenting them to the world? And the board has to say, okay, I get it, I buy it. That's not the end of it. Management has to disclose that and explain it to the investors. And up until now, you don't really see that. You see kind of generic, management uses these measures because it believes that it is a better representation of the underlying business, ... It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, of course, but why? Explain to me why you believe that and make me believe it. Right now, disclosures don't have that. I think companies are going to be getting comment letters, maybe not this quarter, but probably starting next year, saying, beef up that disclosure. You're really not explaining anything.
Another committee besides the audit committee that has to be very concerned with this is the compensation committee. Yes. Well, of course, you said the whole board, which is true, but the compensation, to the extent compensation is paid based on some of these adjustments, then this is really important and really important for encouraging long-term value creation. There are a lot of good practices in this area. Some compensation committees even have the chairman of the audit committee on them. And if that's not the case, then surely the chairman of the compensation committee should be talking to the chairman of the audit committee as these measures work their way into the comp programs.
I think one of the tests that management has to be able to deal with is whether it's for the audit committee, the auditors, or whatever, said, okay, so you say this is important now. Don't tell me 2 years is no longer important. Because if it represents something about your company that's meaningful and investors need to know about it, why wouldn't it be so in 18 months or 2 years from now as well too? So I think it's a test. Does this thing have legs that it works as far as defining this company is concerned?
Well, and Bill, to that point, I mean, and I'll pose this as a question to you guys. Well, shouldn't the use of non-GAAP measures also tie into the strategy of the entity?
Absolutely.
And how do they link to that strategy? And to me, at the end of the day, management owns the strategy, but so does that board.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, and boards need to keep that in mind. They own the strategy. They approve that strategy. So how do these non-GAAP measures tie into that strategy, and why is it important?
Yeah.
And we're not
that's
going to
sort of
answer that
the
question.
additional answer that you were looking for is why, it
Tell
better
us why.
reflects the business, but tell us why.
But I just want to tie this back
Yeah,
to
you're
what
gonna
we
be the
were
last
talking
word on
about.
this one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of energy.
There is.
Just to tie it back to the quarterly capitalism discussion, the fact is that quarterly guidance and that whole system, that's all based on non-GAAP figures. And so long as we have that quarterly guidance culture, non-GAAP is going to continue to exist, and it's going to be tempting for people to play games or manage it.
So we do have a number of questions from our audience members on non-GAAP, so I'm going to move them along too. But this might be a good topic for a future webcast because I think there's a lot of passion and energy. But now I'm going to turn us over to slide 10, and we're going to talk about some of the warning signs of short-termism. And we talked a little bit earlier, I think the McKinsey study talked about how some CEOs and other C-suite executives felt that short-termism could lead to a decline in investment in the business, business development. That would certainly, I think, be a warning sign. But, and I'm curious both from Doug, from your perspective, and Karen and Bill, and then Jose, I want to get you in on this too. What are some of the other warning signs that management, boards, auditors look for that short-termism is out of balance or isn't connected to the long-term strategy? So Doug, I'll start with you.
Well, I guess, one thing that I think could or should be a warning sign is, you hear boards and directors complain saying, these days we don't have enough time to focus on strategy in the boardroom because there are so many compliance and oversight and monitoring obligations that fill up all of our time, especially at the audit committee. And I think when you start hearing that's definitely worrisome, that the board itself feels that they are not getting adequate time to talk strategy, hear about strategy, and challenge it, and eventually buy into it. So I think that's, when people start hearing that, either, management or the auditors or other advisors, I think that's a time where people have to tell, the management that's setting, or the chair that's setting the agenda, hey, let's take this, that's a serious comment.
Well, of course, the first one on the slide is infrequent discussions about future-oriented topics, and talking about the future and outside environment in the boardroom is really, really important. Also, one of the really important things directors do is discuss and approve capital allocation, and that is really in the guts of importance to getting to the long term.
So I think I'd add 2 points to what both Doug and Karen have said. One is that boards should be asking who is the main competition? Who are new entrants into the marketplace that we haven't dealt with before? How's the technology of the way this industry works changed? What is the possibility that the way we go to market will be obsoleted in the future? And so it goes back to one of the comments that Doug's made. You don't have time to look at strategy for looking at the regulations and the control spec. That's one thing. But if you start your strategy discussions with presentations by each of your division presidents on what they did and what they're going to do, it's sort of steering from the rearview mirror. We shouldn't probably be looking at what we did. we ought to be looking at what the competition's done. Who are the new small entrants? Because they're the ones that change things, not the big organizations. And so how do those pieces come together? And so I think, boards need to be careful that the discussion they're having is about the future. Because what is it? 12 of the Fortune 500 companies in 1955 exist today. And a lot of that's because they miscalled the future. And they were bought by somebody else or they went away. And so I think it goes back to Jose's points. The board owns that strategy. And so if you're not spending good time every meeting on talking about where you're heading, you may be a victim of short-termism.
And one of the things that I've seen boards do is when they have their strategic planning retreats, one of the things they do is create the agenda for the next year about the topics relating to that strategy that simply must be covered.
So Jose, we have a question from one of our audience members, which I think is interesting, and I think it could get to the issue of fraud. And that is, are you all seeing short-term pressures affecting middle management? We've talked about it on the C-suite level through investors, through outside pressures. But what about middle management? And is that a potential red flag for fraud?
Absolutely it is. In fact, I would probably bring it down even below middle management. If I've got an entity that's very Salesforce focused, there's an awful lot of pressure on the Salesforce to meet targets. It could be, to make their superiors look better. Could be to, achieve their own level of compensation because they've got certain sales targets. So yes, I think if the tone isn't right and the focus is extremely short term, it's not just the C-suite that's affected. It's all the way down the chain. And if you look at a lot of the frauds that have occurred, not necessarily at the C-suite. It's middle management, lower management that had to get that sales number to a certain amount of dollars. And guess what? They either stuffed channels or they inflated sales or they did something else.
Take Jose's point. If you're, let's say you're compensating folks on inventory turns, probably shouldn't do it on a quarterly basis because you can game it. Mm-hmm. You can just move inventory out. If you did it on a year or 2 year or 3 year base, you can't do that. So you're going to be making more balanced kinds of things. So I think that's the kinds of things that audit committees, auditors, and the board ought to be looking for on the key things you're paying the folks for. Are you inducing appropriate behavior that you want to be a part of the organization and that incentivizes the individuals within it to make the right kinds of decisions? Or is it overweighted in the short term?
And it goes back, and I believe this personally, philosophically, is in order for me to be an effective auditor, I need to understand well the organization, what drives behavior in that organization, and I need to really understand the industry. Mm-hmm. And if I don't have both those things, I can fill and check all the box as an auditor, but I don't think I'm being an effective auditor.
I want to talk just for a minute about CEO turnover. So we talked earlier about how CEOs need at least 2 years, and they often don't get it. But is CEO turnover an indication of a misalignment between short-term and long-term strategies? And Doug, I don't know if this is something that was addressed in your report.
I don't think we specifically addressed it in the report, but I think in the aggregate, the data show that CEO tenure has gotten shorter over the last number of years. Obviously, CEO turnover there's so many factors that go into why a CEO is hired, fired, replaced, etc. And so you can't really point to specific companies or industries. You got to look at the aggregate as symbolic of something. And I think, it is a sign that people at the top are under more pressure to perform right away and get more instant results, and boards are perhaps less patient with them, investors are less patient with them, and so it's this whole dynamic of I want quicker results, or there are going to be consequences.
How does the board deal with that? Do you look at the turnover of a CEO? I can't remember what the average tenure of a CEO is, but it's pretty short. I believe it's under 5 years. You know, how do you, as a board, incentivize the company to have a longer term when the CEO might not even be there that long?
Well, let me speak to it, maybe picking up on some of Doug's comments and with respect to the CEO. So there are a lot of pressures that are on senior management to perform from all the points of view that people have mentioned here. And so, as we've discussed, we need to be looking at the strategy, the long term, and then tying the short term things to that. One of the mistakes maybe that CEOs make when they're doing that is because the nature of the people that tend to end up in those roles lots of times, they tend to be optimistic. I can do that. And they may outlook that says, we can accomplish this new strategy shift in 2 years or in 3 years. Where in fact, if you took it and broke it down into its pieces of what are the short-term things you need to do, how long does it take you to get a new channel to market up and running and productive and at a volume level that overcomes one of the things that maybe is going away, how long does it take for the people to be hired, the skills to be found, to put in place, implemented, mature, and be able to run. And you set an expectation maybe that's too short. So I think the board needs to challenge management is don't be too pie in the sky in what you say you can do. Be thoughtful about it, plan it out accurately, tell us why it is the way it is, defend why it's 4 years, not 2 years, and then we'll support you on that, and it might have an impact on the whole dynamic of the turnover on CEOs.
I want to look on this slide too. One of the warning signs is dividends and stock buybacks. That could be a warning sign of too much focus on short-termism. And I know both the NACD and the Conference Board report did address that. So why are buybacks bad? Are they made at the expense of long-term investment? When are buybacks used? I'm just curious as to the panel's views on buybacks.
Well, I think the idea behind buybacks is that the company feels that their stock is at a price that they feel it's undervalued and it's a good long-term investment, and the company is going to buy back some of its stock and watch it go up. I think the data sets show that most companies end up, buying at the high point for, whatever reason. And so, that kind of takes that away. But when you're buying back stock, you are making a decision that you're going to use that to buy back stock as opposed to do other things with it. And maybe the do other things with it is just to kind of keep it there in anticipation of a major acquisition or something like that. So you are making decisions, you are signaling certain things to the market. And so they're not inherently bad. But when a company is doing this over and over again, and it seems like that's kind of propping up their EPS numbers, and in terms of, you look at their revenues, the revenues are really going nowhere. That's when you really got to ask, okay, what is the strategy here beyond buybacks?
Determining how much leverage a company should have is both art and science, and that seems to me a sweet spot for the board to have the kind of conversation that talks about we need to be in business over a cycle, and so where are we in the cycle and what kind of protection do we need in the long term, but you have to see how risk averse the various participants are, because over risk aversion, of course, doesn't make good enough use of the shareholder dollars. So it's a very important discussion that will depend on very importantly the industry and the outside environment, but on that company as well.
I had an experience both as a chair and then as a CEO with respect to that. We had decided, and a great deal of strategy work we had done with the board, as to where we wanted to go and how we wanted to reposition the company. And that meant for us that in addition to more in our own development investment, we believed, to make substantial acquisitions. So over about an 24 month period, we made well over a dozen acquisitions, spent a lot of money on it. Where I was asked constantly by our shareholders, what's that doing for us? That's our money. What's it doing for us? What's the return on it? Obviously, we were reluctant to give individual returns on individual acquisitions because it takes time for them to become mature inside the organization. So we did hold the line on it and didn't do a lot of buybacks. Got a lot of pressure from our investors. You've got, because we were in a very nice cash position. That's our money. You need to give some of it to us. We resisted that and accomplished our transition and then did a major stock buyback. But I think there again, it ties back to what we were talking about. You need to know where you're going, know what you need to do to get there, and have the board and management locked together on that, understanding in detail, and be able to describe, we got the target, we know where we're going, this is why we're investing our money the way it is, and it may not be in a buyback.
Well, I think that's a really important point, your last one, and that is communicating to your investors about what your short-term and long-term strategies are and how they fit together. So do any of you have good examples? You just gave us one, Bill, but of other companies that do that well, that articulate well to the market and to investors how their short-term strategies fit into their longer-term strategy?
Well, I generally don't want to kind of name companies, but I will go
You
ahead.
can do it generically.
Well, no, I mean, in this case, I've got two examples. One recent example is Disney. Bob Iger, the CEO, on a recent earnings call when the analysts were focused on kind of, TV revenues. He said, well, look, what about all of these things that we have planned for the longer term health of the company? You are focused very much on this quarter-to-quarter TV revenue, but if you look at other parts of the business, so he's brave enough to say to the analysts, hey guys, stop looking at the shiny object, look at these things. I think another company that did a good job of this years ago was Verizon, when they decided, their strategy was, we are going to place a big bet on fiber optics and build out this amazing Fios network that we think is really going to be huge. And they had to tell people, be patient. This is going to be a long-term play. I guess Amazon is another one, losing money for years. And people say, look, we're running out of patience here. And finally they said, look, the strategy paid off. We are the 800-pound gorilla now. So those are some examples where, but it takes leadership.
It takes courage.
I think GE is a great example right now too, because Jeff has stepped in there and taken it from one structure to a very different structure. In fact, just recently, weeks ago, they announced they aren't a significant financial organization anymore, took enormous amount of regulation off them. He said, we are a manufacturing and service organization. To that, he has totally transitioned the company, and I think was speaking to their owners. It's apparent the whole time he was doing it as well, too. So I think they accomplished it in a very effective way.
Great. So good examples. And I do think shareholder communication and engagement is really important in this area.
But you can't always tell them what you think they want to hear, which is, I think, what we see a lot of, unfortunately.
Well, and you also don't want to tell your competitors too much about your strategy
that's also a great point, yeah.
So let's go on to slide 11 and talk about some actionable recommendations. We promised that we would give our audience some things to take back with them and to think about, and so I want to make sure that we spend some time about that. So let's start with the board. Karen and Bill, what advice would you give a board member with respect to both the short-term, long-term strategy, with respect to communicating with shareholders, the whole host of issues that we've been talking about? And then that also gets to what skill sets do boards need to be able to look at this in this complex environment?
Go ahead.
Well, and let's start with where you ended on skill sets. I think boards are getting much better these days about asking what skill sets they need around the table. And of course, if we're talking about long-term value creation, we're talking about what skill sets we're going to need 3 and 5 years and more down the road, because it takes a new director a while to come up to being very productive on the board. And so getting really good at talking about the skill sets we need and bringing those skill sets onto the board is just fundamental to all of this.
Yeah, I think, I'm coming toward 20 years on boards, and what boards did back then and what I think they need to do now are two very different things. It was, I think at that time, okay to get the information from management, review it, get prepared for it, and go to the board meetings and have the dialogues around those. In today's world, I think that's far short of what directors need to do. When we speak of activist boards need to be doing some of the very same work that activists do. They need to understand the industry in a very detailed kind of way. And I'm talking about individual directors now too, not just the board. They need to look at new entrants, competitors in the marketplace. They need to look at new technological shifts, things that will render what we do today and makes us very competitive, not as competitive in the future, and on and on. Now you say, where do they get that? You get it online. You Google all those things, and you can find out who the new entrants are. You can find out what their financials are. You can get all that information. And so for a board member today, and I've said this in forums in the past, to go to a board meeting, having received the material, studied the material, if that's what they do, they go unprepared. And they're not in the category of the board that's engaged and enabling where the company is heading with a strategy point of view. It takes a lot more work and a lot more time.
One of the things boards need to do is really understand investor communications. We've been talking about investor communications, but the way that we can pursue long-term value creation is in partnership with our investors. And so over my period of years on boards as well, I've watched investor communications change greatly, but I've watched the oversight from directors change significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that point goes to, just understanding or having some kind of philosophy about what the job entails. I think there's still a lot of directors out there who say, investor communication, that's not really part of my job description, because traditionally it really hasn't been in this country. Right. But it's changing dramatically, and the expectation is changing. I wonder how many boards, I think boards could benefit from having some kind of executive session. Maybe it's the self-evaluation where they say, hey, let's agree, what is our job description? Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing in this function? Not asking individual board members what they think their job is, but as a board, can we, at least come around the same principles of what the job description is? I'm not sure boards do that, and I think once they do that, they have a better understanding for everybody and become a much more effective group. And eventually, when they do communicate with investors, they can explain that this is our philosophy on what we see our role.
Jose, I want to talk to you a little bit about the current economic conditions of a company and trends emerging in a company with respect to the liquidity. Mm-hmm. Is that something that external auditors are focused on when you go in and do the audit?
Absolutely. We have an obligation. Actually, management has an obligation to disclose its liquidity position, its ability to continue as a going concern, and I, as an auditor, have a responsibility to assess that and make my own judgments on it. But to me, liquidity, we've talked about stock buybacks, we talked about dividends, but one of the key things I think that any organization needs to do, and I look at very closely, quite frankly, is looking what is the cash projection or liquidity projection of a company for the next 5 years? How have they executed on that liquidity position? Are there changes in the economic environment that may affect that liquidity position based on my knowledge of the industry, of the economic environment? So I've got to take all that and make an assessment. So absolutely, and one of the things that if I understand what that strategy is, what's it going to take, and understanding why the buybacks versus capital and investing in capital, that helps me make a more informed and better decision or assessment as an auditor. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it does. And then what about, we've touched on it a little bit, but let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on incentive compensation arrangements, because it seems to me that can both drive short-term thinking, particularly when we couple it with shorter tenures for CEOs. I think it can drive to a risk of fraud. We certainly talk about it with respect to senior management, but what about in middle management? We talked a little bit about that drill down effect with respect to getting short-term results. But I'm just curious, all of you, what your views are on how incentive compensation ties to short-term focus.
Well, I'll let the auditor start this time. From an auditor perspective, one of the things I'm always key to understand is what drives that CEO. And though a lot of us talk about, well, money's not my driver. Well, it does play a part in what drives an organization. So I look at what the key metrics or components of his compensation package is. If I see a compensation package that is just, extremely weighted to results, quite frankly, as an auditor, I've got to apply a significant amount more skepticism. Okay, what could they be doing to drive that end result? And does that end result make sense with the economic environment, the industry, and everything else? But I do look very carefully at what are the compositions of that executive's incentive programs are. And if they're only tied to financial results, I'm telling you, my skepticism level just absolutely rises.
So what other metrics could they be tied to other than financial results?
Some of the non-GAAP things to take us back on our conversation. So you want to move to a new channel of distribution from what you've been in the past. So how many distributors do you need? When do you need them? How long does it take to get them up to speed? What volume do you expect from them? What's the ramp of that volume that goes back? Some of the key measures that would be good indicators of how successful they're being at that will, if in fact your goal is to where you had, let me just make it up, 3% of your revenue coming from that method of a distribution, and you wanted to take it to 30%, what do you need to do to get there, and are you paying your people to get you there? And so I think the discussion around compensation is a tough one. You've got to balance the ability for them to earn, which they want to do. You've got to balance the ability to be competitive in the marketplace because other folks are paying them for other things. You've got to look at how do you still incentivize those folks to do those things because it's our future and we need to get there. And so I think the comp committee and the audit committee and the full board need to be very thoughtful about it. You don't want to just go in and say, we're not going to pay you for that, because then you may lose your opportunity to get to where you want to get to. But doing it the wrong way and paying people just on the financial rewards that can be, frankly, long-term not as beneficial is dangerous. So is not looking at all the things, are we competitive with the competition? Will we keep our best employees? Do they have the skills and capability to get us to where we want to go? And are we paying them in a way? And I think this is one of the things we tried to look at as management. The way you measure them and pay them, your employees should be able to get out of bed in the morning, come to work and say, I can affect those outcomes. I know what I have to do to make that possible. And if you can tie it in that way, then I think you're probably incentivizing and paying in the right way.
Our compensation programs have to be terribly carefully thought out. But as I think we talked about earlier, there's the public environment keeps us looking more like each other, and in having a narrower set of triggers to pull in our metrics. So one thing I've seen done in a company for the CEO, the compensation metrics are all out there, and that's what the compensation's based on. But in terms of performance reviews, having the CEO and the board have a discussion at the beginning of the period, the year, saying these are the 5 most important things that the CEO can do this year. And then as the year progresses, not every meeting of course, but as the year progresses, have that short list in mind, and that it is the board's evaluation of performance that of course then does tie into compensation.
What about board compensation? That's been in the news a lot lately. I think there's the use of stock options or other investment into the company is sometimes in favor, sometimes out of favor. I'm just curious what you all think about that, and if that ties into short-termism at all.
Well, I mean, the debate over director comp, I think, is something that, it recently it's come up a lot. There have been lawsuits over it. I think it is important to look at. I don't know if it's really the driver of the company's short-term or long-term behavior, though. I think that's really more management and the actions that the board takes. But I guess my 2 cents is that it should not be weighted heavily towards equity. I know a lot of people who say the board represents the investors, they should have all the skin in the game, pay them all in stock. I said that's the dumbest, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. Then you're going to turn the board into the stock watchers. They're going to be checking their terminals on a daily basis, worried about their own pocketbooks. That's not the kind of behavior, and that's not the kind of thinking you want from directors. I mean, I think a lot of these directors would get paid. Some of them would do it for free. Some of them would do it for just cash. So to satisfy some of the investor concern about skin in the game, you have to have some part of it tied to equity. But it could be tied to equity which you don't get to touch until you leave the board. These types of things. But I think that the exec comp discussion is more important, because I think that's more where the temptation comes to really start to manage to certain things and in bad situations even manipulate things.
I think Doug hit a good point. I think a combination of cash and equity are good. I think board members shouldn't be able to cash in on equity until after they're off the board. And you could even have a discussion that it should be a year after they're off the board. That way they do the right things for the company, and hopefully they'll last for a long term, and they'll expect to benefit from it a year after that, so that they're not being incentivized to make short-term decisions. So number one. Number two, I think they do need to be compensated appropriately, but it needs to be consistent with how hard they're working too, and that's one of the topics we had earlier. So I think we are asking more of directors. We are expecting more from directors, and we are expecting more effort from directors. And so I think that keeping that in the right balance is an important one, but I don't think it's when you step back and look at all the activity that's going on, whether it's activism or anything else, I don't think that's the one that's churning the pot as much as others.
So one last question before we do our lightning round of key takeaways. And we talked earlier about quarterly earnings guidance and how that factors into this, but I think we all came to the conclusion that that's probably not going to go away. Should companies start issuing long-term guidance, giving their long-term prospects on a quarterly basis as they do with the quarterly earnings?
How would that, I guess, how would you envision that? What does that look like?
it just seems like we don't have a mechanism for a company to really talk about their long-term vision, right? They report out on a quarterly basis because that's what the market wants. But is there a mechanism for them to report their long-term vision too?
Well, I think companies have a whole host of tools at their disposal to communicate with the investor community, starting with the quarterly earnings calls. I mean, I wish those would go away, but to the extent they exist, that's the time to do it. Other board or other communications, your annual report, the letter, the letter from the chair to the shareholders, and then these in-person or live engagements that we've been talking about, roadshows, one-on-ones, industry conferences. That's really where you can articulate this. And no, I don't think you can have, like tenure guidance, because that's putting a lot of pressure on people to predict the future where, we have no idea, what's going to happen, a year from now in terms of all kinds, the earth could blow up next year, that kind of scenario. So I think that'd be difficult to hold people to. But I think, forcing companies to actually articulate it, that's probably the board's prerogative to tell management, hey, get out there and tell your story. You have a good story to tell it.
And you do have lots of vehicles, as you just pointed out. There are the written vehicles, which the lawyers and the auditors and the SEC will tell us a lot about how they need to look. But there's all kinds of innovation in terms of using written vehicles as communication that's ever more understandable by investors, and then we have calls and meetings and so forth. And I see companies really thinking about all of these vehicles in a way to make them more useful to investors, and that's a good development.
I think one of the ways that we tried to do it was you always have investor briefings, and a lot of them are one-on-one. Sometimes they sponsor them, but we always had an investor day where we had all the investors attend, and that is what we talked about. We talked about our long-term strategy. Where are we going, and and then we look back a little bit too. Okay, so here's why we did what we did. This contributes to what we plan to do in the future. This is where we're going. This is our intent. This is where we want to compete. This is where we're not going to compete. This is why we think we're able to compete here. This is what we think our sustainable market advantage is with respect to that. And these are the kinds of things we have done, which are contributing to the things we want to do in the future. And then have a dialogue with all those investors. We did in one room, and took Q's and A's for a great portion of the time, where you talked about the future and refused to talk about the quarter.
So we are nearing the end of our time together. It went very quickly, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So one of the things I like to do at the end of these webcasts is to ask each one of you the same question, and that is, given that we've covered a lot of ground, what one thing would you have our viewers remember from our discussion today? So, Mr. McCracken, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. We've sort of said it a lot today, but I just give it a simple term: get on offense. Do the things we've been talking about. Be engaged as a director, as an audit committee, in the details of your company, of your industry, and your business. And if you do those types of things, you become, the term that I like to use is an activist director. And you're on offense. So if somebody shows at the door, you don't have to then rock back and say, geez, do I increase the dividend? Do I do a buyback? Rather, you say, here's where we're going. Here's why we should go there. And here's why we believe it's the right set of decisions for us to make. And that's what we're here for, and that's where we're going. So you do it in advance, not as a reaction, because I think a lot of the actions you've seen on the part of boards, on the things they have done or seats they've lost or whatever, is because, frankly, they weren't as prepared as they could have been.
Jose?
I'm going to go back to tone at the top. Make sure that a board and the investors and others understand what the tone at the top is in an organization. And that will drive a lot of the behaviors. Bad tone will drive probably inappropriate behaviors, probably lead to some not great non-GAAP measures. But if you have the right tone, I think you will get the metrics right, you'll get the strategy right, and be able to bifurcate it between long and short term. But I think it starts there, and I think the board actually the board plays a very important role in setting that tone. And I think it's something that the board needs to continuously monitor, look at, and remember. The tone can start with them.
Doug?
I'll go back to the quarterly capitalism idea, and I think boards and management have to go back and look at their overall internal and external communication strategies and plans, and to what extent are those completely built around the quarterly earnings system. I think for a lot of companies it is, internal and external. That sends the message to everybody that quarterly results are the most important thing, and we are going to basically live quarter to quarter. I think if obviously you can't get entirely away from that, but there are ways you can, de-emphasize it, or at least reduce the emphasis and build on the timeline that you think is appropriate, not what you're being told by analyst community.
And Karen?
We've talked a lot about specifics in this webcast, and I want to end with a very general point that culture drives behavior, and it's not unrelated to tone, and it's not unrelated to what we've all said it as we've been talking, but it really, on this as well as so many other subjects that are crucial to our businesses, culture does drive behavior, and the board's job is to understand the culture as well as it can and encourage the kinds of culture changes that need to be.
Great. Well, in closing, I want to express my appreciation to our panelists, Doug, Karen, Bill, and Jose. Thank you all for joining us and giving us your valuable insights. It's been a really good webcast. And I also want to thank all of our viewers for watching today. I would ask that you viewers take a moment to complete the webcast survey. A link to that survey should have popped up in a separate window on your computer screen. We take your feedback and value it, so we hope you'll take the time to fill that out. And for those of you who want to obtain a copy of your CPE certificate, it will be ready immediately following the webcast. All you need to do is click on the CPE button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't have an opportunity to obtain your CPE certificate during today's presentation, you may get that after 24 hours by logging back into the event and clicking the Get CPE icon. Please note, though, that you will not be able to respond to the attendance checks in the archive, and you must have fulfilled the attendance requirements during the actual presentation to qualify for CPE. If you have any questions regarding NACD credit, please contact the NACD directly. And colleagues who were unable to join today can view an archive of this webcast, which will soon be available on the CAQ's and the Anti-Fraud Collaboration's websites. So with that, I'm Cindy Fornelli for the Center for Audit Quality, wishing you all a pleasant day. Thank you.